In this interview, we talk to Julian Sindall, Director of Cadenza Transport Consulting Limited. We talk to Julian about the impact COVID-19 will have on transport providers, the way that people choose to travel to and from work, and whether we think there'll be a greener, more sustainable way of transport in the future. As ever, we'd love your feedback, your comments, so please get in touch, please discuss below. Otherwise, we look forward to catching up with you soon. Thanks.
My name is Julian Sindall. I am Director of Cadenza Transport Consulting, and we specialise in early stage railway feasibility studies and also strategic asset management, as well as some project management and railway training opportunities. Well, I think what we've seen is quite clearly a dramatic reduction in public transport, less of a reduction in personal private transport, but the short-term trend is clearly right down at the moment, and that's going to be this is clearly an issue for all of those public transport providers. The question is going to be, how do we come out of COVID-19, and how willing are people going to be suddenly in a position where social distancing is not very easy to do? And so I think that depending on what the government decides its strategy is, we could see quite a long period before people come back to public transport, as far as they have the option to do so. And I think this is one of the key questions is that will drive whether people actually change their habits going forward, is whether they actually have the ability to do so, whether that's in terms of having a working environment at home, whether they do work that can be done at home. There are plenty of businesses where people can't work from home. So I think there are going to be some medium-term changes as we come out of COVID, and hopefully when we get to the end of it, I think we're going to see some change, but not everyone by all means. I think there's going to be some people who just can't change, they can't work from home, and they have to go back to using public transport. I think one of the things that we're going to find is that people shift much more to working 2 or 3 days from home, and that in turn drives a different kind of pricing mechanism for transport operators. London Underground used to have carnet style tickets, so you would buy 10 tickets in advance and you get them at a certain discount, and then you could use those as and when you needed to. And that was great for people who were making infrequent journeys. The carnet style ticket disappeared a long time ago, but I think what we're going to see much more is a kind of electronic version of the same sort of thing, which will suit people who don't want to pay for a season ticket, but nevertheless want to find a way of perhaps getting some sort of discount for bulk buy, or increasing usage over time. So I think transport operators are going to need to think very carefully about how they price their tickets, how they offer their tickets for a different world. And I think other forms of transport like aircraft are going to see a very, very different environment when we emerge from this thing. Buses, I think, are probably not going to change very much, because I think that quite a lot of people who use buses as their main form of transport often don't have many other options, and they don't have a private car perhaps, or the journey is short enough or sufficiently remote from rail transport. They don't really have any other options. So I think buses will probably come back to normal, but and it might be for shorter journeys, though. People might take on some of the exercising that they've been doing over the last few weeks and start cycling a bit more, maybe even running or walking to work. But I think, as well as choosing to work different days and fewer days, I think people are going to start thinking very much about the time of day that they travel. Is it really necessary to be in the office for 9 o'clock? But employers have got to grasp the nettle here as well. They've got to start moving away from a clock in, clock out mentality, and start perhaps measuring their employee output more than their input. But if they can do that, if they can do that, and not all businesses can, then we're going to see the pressure back on the transport operators to think about how they encourage travelling at different times. And that could well lead to much more dynamic pricing mechanisms. We've seen the railway industry over the last 5-10 years move a bit more towards yield pricing, but it's still quite static, and I think we could see that becoming really dynamic to the extent that it changes by the minute or even by the second for a particular train, a particular ticket. I think what we're seeing is a general change towards wanting to travel long distances into cities like London and Birmingham, and people wanting to work more locally to home. So they may not be able to abandon travelling altogether and work from home, but they may be willing to look at finding jobs that are closer to home that allow them to try different forms of transport. Now, what that could also mean is that the government's Beaching Reversals Fund initiative aimed at reinstating or reconnecting different locations that are a bit more close to home could well open up all sorts of opportunities for smaller town centres to rediscover their mojo, to grow again, because people are wanting to move away from going up to work in London or Manchester or Birmingham. I certainly don't think it's the case that HS2 is not needed now because everybody's going to be working from home. I just don't think it works like that. Yes, there'll be some people will work from home, but actually I think people will discover, as they're discovering now, that the social interaction is really important. And so as soon as they can, I think they'll be back out seeing friends and making those journeys. And certainly when we look ahead to when HS2 is actually finally delivered, that people will have forgotten the fine promises they made about not travelling during COVID-19. I think in the short term, we're going to see people dropping back to their cars as a socially distancing means of getting from A to B. But I think we'll fairly quickly run into capacity constraints that we already have. So that will then start forcing people back onto public transport or avoiding travel altogether. So I think we're going to see quite a few changes. I think it'd be very difficult in the early days to really spot trends happening. Well, I think there's some general trends already happening in transport, particularly first and last mile. There's a rising push for e-scooters to be legislated for, and that's probably slipped a little bit further down the to-do list in the Department for Transport just at the moment. But it nevertheless it's got a big push, and I think that could, if that's legislated for, it could make quite a significant change to the provision for car parks at stations. I was saying earlier that many journeys are between 1 and 3 miles for people to get to the station, and actually if they can do that quite simply on an e-scooter and find somewhere to safely lock up and even charge their scooter while they're at the station, that would be a major breakthrough in what we are doing in terms of carbon for stations at the moment. I think there are other ways in which transport networks are likely to change, particularly as we move more towards electric vehicles and ideally towards autonomous vehicles. And that will change quite radically how people view ownership of a vehicle as a necessity. In terms of long-term capacity, we just can't keep building roads, and particularly in the cities, we just can't keep building more roads because the capacity will just expand to fill the space. We actually need to find ways, inventive ways, of encouraging people to try different forms of transport. There is a much greater push now, particularly with the current Conservative government, into some better cycling provision. And I would like to see local authorities making it much more of a mandated obligation that if you're building a new road, then the cycling infrastructure must come with it. And I've seen on a project I worked on in Belgium a few years ago, very large sort of almost M25 equivalent, came with it the need to provide cycling provision along the same length. And I think if you can provide cycling to a standard where people who currently feel it's unsafe to cycle are prepared to get on a bike, then you've really nailed it.